Race has always been a sensitive topic in the United States. One turning point for the African American status in the country was the Civil Rights Movement. However, what caused the Civil Rights Movement? The cause of the Civil Rights Movement was African American being treated as the inferior race in America. The discrimination took place in blacks having their segregated restaurant and other social facilities in which the quality was worse than the whites. In addition, constantly getting hateful threats and physical abuse by the KKK. It was after a decade of blacks fighting for their rights that they had eventually gained back their essential human rights that any human being should attain, which resulted in the banning of discrimination based on race and cultural background. Segregation played a large role in racism. This has shown in history before the Civil Rights Movement, as blacks had their own restrooms and restaurants designed by the whites. As the author in Georgetown Law School brought up this in his article, Introduction to Civil Rights for Blacks, blacks were segregated in school, restaurants, and transportation, and in other forms of public accommodations. They were discriminated against for employment, and all of this was legal. Not only was it legal, it was considered normal, exactly as it should be. This indicated the normalized racism in America before the Civil Rights Movement. This segregation contributed to the rise of the Civil Rights Movement. Another key problem that sparked civil rights protests in the southern states was the Ku Klux Klan's persecution of blacks. They especially targeted liberated blacks in the southern states to incite violence and hatred. This made blacks feel insecure when they are in public. The author of National Geographic's article, The Ku Klux Klan, mentioned this about the KKK. Throughout the South, lynching and intimidation were prevalent. The KKK used secrecy, intimidation, violence, and murder to prevent formerly enslaved African American men from voting. Black office holders and their supporters were especially targeted. This was an indication of the KKK's callous deeds, which then would eventually lead to African Americans' resistance and demonstration. The Civil Rights Movement was born out of these factors. As you can see, this is a visual aid of the KKK. The Civil Rights Campaign had the consequence of outlawing all discrimination based on race, religion, or cultural background. Since segregation in social facility was no longer permitted, and discriminatory employment decisions were ruled illegal from that point forward. History.com authors said this in their Civil Rights Act of 1964 article. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended segregation in public places and banning employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, is considered one of the crowning legislative achievements of the Civil Rights Movement. All sorts of human rights were extended to persons of any race and cultural background after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which marked a turning point in the relationship between minorities and whites in the United States of America. God is always watching the human's presence, and he knows that justice always prevails. It just needs time to prove itself. The oppression of African Americans was the roots of Civil Rights Movement. This suppression came through social segregation, as well as the KKK threats. However, all of these issues contributed to the start of the Civil Rights Movement. As a result of the Civil Rights Movement, all human beings are granted the same rights in the United States of America. Thank you.